Just by way of personal introduction, my name is Andy Black. I'm originally a surgeon. I worked for several years in the NHS, and over the last, actually 22 years, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry as a consultant. So it's possible, using the 20-year rule, that some of the things I said 20 years or so ago might be actually starting to turn out to be correct now, but who knows? Hopefully at least some of them are. Over the last 11 years, I founded and ran a business called Kynaps as the chief executive, and I now sit on the board of that business. So actually I'm going to pass over to my colleagues at the table. So Mike, maybe you could start us off with your introduction, please.
Hi, I'm Mike Rea. I'm the founder and chief executive of Idea Pharma, which is a path-to-market design group. We design, we design commercial models back into early phase to look at how pharma companies can better design path to market for early phase assets.
Thank you.
Harry Stratford, 47 years in the industry now, so I'm a bit of a fossil. I've been in big pharma and was the founder and CEO at Shire and the founder and CEO of Prostracan. I'm now a non-exec director of an emerging specialty pharma business called Neurocentrics and a couple of other specialty pharma companies in the UK and Ireland.
So I'm Richard Seabrook with the innovations team at the Wellcome Trust, and we manage Wellcome's translational funding, which we use as program-related investment into healthcare projects, the purpose of which is to take great ideas from the research base and put them onto a product development pathway. And we do this either within the academic environment or within the SME or even large pharma environment, where we can be convinced as an important public health program, and we can do it in a way which doesn't necessarily subsidize the shareholder. So through this mode of operation, we operate across drug discovery, vaccines, medtech and diagnostics. We've been operating in this way for about 12 years and can identify about 30 products that we've helped support and get to market. That includes 2 cell therapies, no drugs or vaccines yet, but hopefully over the next 5 years we'll be able to lay claim to some successful drugs and vaccines.
Good afternoon, my name's Rob Smith. I head up product development in Europe for Catalent. I spent about 5 years with Catalent, and prior to that I've spent time in the other CDMOs in this area, and also I've worked for big pharma as well. Started off life in biotech as well.
Thanks. Good afternoon, my name is Lucas Utiger. I'm running the drug substance and pharma development services for Patheon. I'm now more than 20 years in the CDMO industry. Have experience in API for many years, but also did stem cell therapy and viral therapy. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, gentlemen. So the title of this plenary panel is The New Pharma Business Model. And I think everyone in the room can probably agree that there is no one new pharma business model. There are plenty of opportunities to innovate in that respect. So what we're going to touch on are some different ways of thinking about the pharma business models, and hopefully get some debate going around the various options out there. I'm actually going to start off with Harry and ask Harry, who has a depth of experience in this area, to what extent he feels the specialty pharma model is appropriate in today's climate.
You could probably guess I'm in favour of it. I don't know about you, but when I go to the supermarket and I get to the yoghurt stand, I'm gobsmacked at the choice. Huge choice. It takes me about 20 minutes to decide which yoghurt to have. Every time I pick the same one. It's plain yoghurt. And why do I pick plain yoghurt? It's because it satisfies a whole series of needs. And that's what our industry has, a whole series of needs. You know, whether you want breakfast, lunch, spicy food, whether you want something exciting and sexy for breakfast, you can make yogurt work. And I liken the specialty pharma business model to a pot of yogurt. The key is that it's all about satisfying the needs of patients. That's really what we're here for. And to do that in an environment that looks at rare diseases, that looks at orphan drugs. There are 7,000 rare diseases. There are 400 orphan drugs. There is a huge opportunity to satisfy, to really help patients. But the world isn't only about patients. You've got to satisfy the doctors. You've got to satisfy the investors. Now that's a tougher order. With a specialty pharma business model, you're capable of having a lean organisation. You're capable of outsourcing all the things your other people are better at than you are. You're capable of providing a series of exit opportunities for investors. The cost of developing is less. On every criteria, it looks attractive as far as I'm concerned. So you've got patients, you've got doctors, you've got investors, payers. Payers need confirmation that they're spending their money wisely. And in the rare disease segment, one can demonstrate the health economics that it's a clear and obvious choice to prescribe rather than not prescribe. And the final group, which often gets forgotten, are the employees. Most people, the vast majority of people, join this industry for one thing, and that's to do good. They actually want to improve the quality and quantity of life for patients. You can see clearly from the specialty pharma business model how that's working. You can quantify it even. Now that's very satisfying from a career point of view. It's also very rewarding from a financial point of view to be involved in such a business. So, and it's just food for thought like the pot of yogurt. But to me, it is fairly obvious that there is a huge opportunity in life sciences.
Excellent. I'm going to ask Mike to come in and talk a little bit about your experience with a wide range of companies in terms of thinking about getting products to market, and any thoughts on business models that have worked well or less well in your experience.
Yeah, so I build on Harry's comments. I think that we're often challenged to think of the industry as a kind of monolithic thing, as if all companies were the same and as if we're all following the same business model. But as someone who a few years ago created the Productive Innovation Index, which was meant to look at which of the top 30 companies are better at launching innovation, the question was, if we gave the same product to two companies at the beginning of phase 2, would they do equally well with it? And of course, everyone knew the answer was no, but we wanted some proof of that, and we come up with a ranking that shows that people still make a difference. So there's no pharma business model. There are individual company business models, and there are ways of tuning that model. And some companies have gone down a specialist route, and some have continue to go down a primary care route. So the question is that a different business model? And I think Harry's touched on some of the main points, which is, does leanness count, and have we seen any benefits to scale in organizations? And I suggest that our industry hasn't really seen any benefits to scale, because if you look at the freshness index is part of what we publish every year, which is how much of last year's sales derive from products that you launched in the last 5 years. Now, it's very interesting. Most large companies have less than 10% of their revenues in last year from products they launched in the last 5 years. So the question is, are we refreshing our pipelines? Well, most major companies aren't, and certainly not doing it by innovation. They're doing it by acquisition. And then you look at, well, which companies are doing better in that space, and it's typically these days smaller biotechs which are launching one product and doing very well with it. So you look at business planning, you say, well, what's the aggregation of scale getting us in our industry? And it's not a lot. So the companies that are doing better are the smaller, leaner, more agile ones that can think differently about the commercial models and design them back into the pipeline. And then you look at the sort of extreme version of Harry's point, which is if we need to think about commercial models which will be there in 5, 10, 15 years' time, we know they're not the same as today. We know we need to prove value. And how do we design that back into the development program? Because we can't just continue to do the same old, and hope that payers will pay for it at some point in the future, because we know they won't. So how do you begin to design real, meaningful endpoints into programs? We certainly find it easier when we get into rare and specialist areas like oncology, but it's not impossible to do it everywhere else. You've got sort of shining lights like Sage Therapeutics in Cambridge that are doing interesting work in CNS. So I think if we think about the business model as by company rather than by industry, and then think about some companies are doing better than others, absolutely. But a lot of that's about the leanness that we put next to the development teams, rather than putting this kind of company-wide template atherosclerosis around the processes.
Lucas, can I pull you in? I know you have a lot of experience working with different businesses, and I'm interested in your sense of, what types of new collaborations are possible. What innovation have you seen that's kind of relevant to the business model question?
Thank you. I think it's a very, very interesting discussion. When I look back 20, 25 years ago, our larger pharma companies actually struggled to accept that CMOs actually could do GMP work. Nowadays, I think this whole thing changed. A lot of APIs are outsourced. When I look at the drug product side, a lot of stuff is done outside. I think, Harry mentioned a very clear topic is, get new drugs faster to market at a reasonable cost. I think that is, for us, very important. And when I look back, there are changes. The changes are slow, but I think nowadays, with larger companies, we have actually now companies that can integrate supply chains in the early development phase up to commercial phase. They have the right regulatory support, the regulatory expertise, and I think what a lot of people underestimate is the experience that we have together. My company does at least 20 to 30 tech transfers on the API stage. If it's bio or small molecules, we do more than 100 tech transfers on drug products. Validations, I think we have an enormous amount of experience, different classes of therapeutics, different technologies, and I think it's now time that maybe we review how we can actually optimize these parts. Whereas, in some of the mid-sized and even larger companies, people work along the whole life on 1 or 2 drugs. They do 1 or 2 validations, and that's their scope of experience. And I think there is a lot of leverage that they can bring to the table.
Very good. One of the observations I'd make about the industry which I've worked in is that there's been a real necessary emphasis on product innovation, identifying the new product to fill the pipeline and to create value ultimately for the company. I personally feel that there have been times when that's slightly been at the expense of really understanding the end customer and looking for ways to add value to the end customer beyond the pill. I wonder if any of my panelists would like to give a few thoughts on to what extent the industry is moving towards becoming more genuinely outcomes orientated, and perhaps more thinking about integration of not just the pill but other elements of solutions as they develop their businesses.
So I'll take that.
Thanks.
So from my company's perspective, we see hundreds of new molecules every year. We put a huge amount of effort into those. And when we look broader across the industry, we see a large number of failures as well. We estimate around 75% of all new molecules coming through aren't really optimized, going to Mike's point earlier. So we believe that we need to put more effort up front. Often we hear, how quickly will this fail? Yeah, not when will we know it's going to be successful. We need to change that mentality. And for me, there's many things that drive that. There's the cost constraints that companies have. There's the critical timelines that all must be adhered to. But there's also a fundamental lack of deep science that's put in place. And we need to change that. And we need to do it by having more precise methods, using numerical modeling, a whole array of different techniques that need to be adopted to be able to drive the industry from this almost how fast will it fail to let's having good quality molecules quickly.
I feel like I want to hear from Richard as well, but I mean, an interesting anecdote from a couple of years ago, we worked with one company and their motto going in was everything we do is about value to the patient. So of course our first question is, what do you mean by value to the patient? How do you quantify value to your patients in this specialist disease area? And they had no scale. Now, clearly there are lots of people who do have scales of measuring value to the patient. Payers are a great example of that, and physicians are another great example of that. So if all of your organization is about adding value to patients and you don't have any scale for it, well, everything happens. And nothing happens because you don't have any way of figuring that out. And that's the first step, is to figure that out, because if you're going to be paid for outcomes, you have to understand them better than anyone else does. That has to be the way that you drive it. And if you feel like patients want something more than they want something else, then you have to be prepared to deliver that to a payer and then prove that you delivered it more than somebody else did in the marketplace. So you can't have a pharma company that's all about value to patients if you don't understand what value to patients means. And I think that's the way that we're thinking about the world going in 5, 10, 20 years, is understanding unmet medical need and then applying that back into a development program that says we're going to get paid for this at some point in the future.
Yeah, if I follow up on that. So clearly, outcomes-based medicines are the way to go, and we need to move in that direction. But it's very difficult, of course, to connect exactly what outcome do different patient groups value. And this is probably a role for the sector which I represent, the charitable sector. Clearly, the charitable sector represents the patient groups and should be working more closely, A, with their patients, and B, with industry, and C, with the regulators, to try and come up with agreed outcomes measures for their respective patient populations. And the emergence of the deep science, the research that we've been funding over the last 10, 15, 20 years has been very much in the molecular basis of medicine, the genomic medicine, and probably less in population health. As a sector, we've been funding less population health and perhaps less public health. And I think that's beginning to change. So I think we're beginning to see, through initiatives like Genome England and other programs which are predecessors of that, the importance of bringing together the molecular basis of medicine together with the patient record and the patient information. And so I think over the next 10 to 15 years, we will see more research in that area and a greater convergence of these two different parts of biomedical research.
Very good. So I've heard a little bit of a tension in the panel, which you might want to kind of encourage a little bit in respect of the benefits of scale, and to what extent scale is important to have impact, and to what extent is being lean and focused ideal. So I had a little bit of a discussion with Harry before the panel started, and Harry's a strong advocate, I think, of building scale. I'd like to talk a bit more about that, if you would, Harry, and maybe talk about how you see merger and acquisition activities supporting that type of growth, and then maybe we can have some debate also in the room about whether that's a robust path to follow.
I think the scale that I think of is the geographic spread, because rare diseases, you need a wide geographic spread. It's not about building a huge infrastructure, because I believe that this room is filled with experts who know far more than I would ever know about the area that they work in. So why not outsource all of that knowledge and skill at the top level? So it's not about that. It's about having a deep portfolio, sure enough. You want as many products, you want as minimum risk, to minimize the risk as much as you can. So have a good portfolio, market it in the territories where it's needed, and that's pretty wide. And in one drug it could be North America and Europe, and in another drug it could be Kurdistan and Portugal and so on and so forth. And what I see M&A, I see a real value of M&A is that is to give you things you haven't got, not just to boost your profit, although that occasionally is very strategically sound. And I'll give you an example. When Shire looked at going public way back, it was told that it needed to be profitable before it could go on the market. And the best way of achieving that was an acquisition of a company called Imperial Pharmaceuticals. And Rolf Stahl, who was then the CEO, acquired Imperial Pharmaceuticals, and it put the company into profit. And it went public. And going public, it enabled it to use its paper to fill its portfolio. Now, that's a very sound strategic reason. And I see M&A just like research. People say M&A is bad. Well, research can be bad. Does it mean you don't do any research? And so it's a valuable tool. It needs to be done right. You need to know why you're doing it, and you need to implement it appropriately. But the whole thing to me is there is a sixth group of needs. This country needs our industry to thrive. Now, it won't thrive unless you've got sustainable businesses. And to get a sustainable business, you need scale, certainly in terms of portfolio size, and certainly in terms of geographic spread. So I see every reason to see M&A as very valuable.
So, thanks, Richard.
We a lot of our effort is with SMEs, and we see a lot of creativity and a lot of innovation with SMEs, and they're really R&D based companies. Very rarely have they got a product or even thinking about manufacturing. And of course, if they're successful, they usually end up getting acquired and swallowed up by a larger company. And what's apparent from that process is that the creativity of that enterprise then tends to get lost in this rather amorphous, large R&D portfolio of a bigger company. So I think there's a lot of experience which shows us that actually, if you're looking to acquire things to enhance your R&D, then how you manage that process and how you integrate it is absolutely pivotal as to whether or not you keep the unique features of the asset that you've acquired. And I think historically Roche and Genentech is cited as a particularly good example of how how Roche didn't take control of what was happening at Genentech for a long period of time. That might have changed more recently. So within the R&D environment, scalability is very, very difficult and very, very fraught. I suspect within manufacturing and sales and marketing, there probably are economies of scale and expanding of portfolios which might justify an increase in scale, but it's very different to the R&D environment.
So just a slightly different spin on that, from a CDMO point of view, what our clients want is that they want that broader selection. They want to see all the yogurts on the shelf. And that's as a business model we're trying to follow. We're looking at inorganic growth, trying to grow our business to give more offerings. Yeah, and that's something that we get asked for a lot of the time. So that will cause natural growth in our organisation. I mean, clients want that one-stop place where they can get everything.
Yeah. I think from my view, it was interesting when former colleagues actually more talked about R&D, access to patients, and not about manufacturing and development. I think that's an area, in my view, where the whole industry should really focus once more is, who is doing what best, where do we have the experience, and how do we actually get this done. When I build a house, I'm not generating my own contract, all-in-one contractor service. I go out and find someone to do this for me and then try to guide this as good as possible. And I think here, when I look at some of these mid-sized, larger companies, they still believe they still have to do everything themselves. Whereas, we have, I think, at the moment, enough good players that can actually take over a lot of work. And there are a lot of very, very strong niche players for niche technologies, if it is in development area, analytical area, or in formulation areas actually that can cover this. I think there's a lot of efficiency gained. I think that's something we owe our patients to get this back.
Just like to ask if anyone has any questions in the room. Excellent. Thank you. We do have a roving mic, so this gentleman at the front here will receive that shortly. Anyone else would like to ask a question? If you put your hand up, we'll get the mic to you. Okay, please, sir.
I'm Martin Lush from NSF Health Sciences. I have a very broad question. The ABPI tagline is about bringing medicines to life. Now, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for 38 years. My question is, how can we do this better and faster? Because in those 35 years, to be frank, the attrition rate from research through to commercialization has remained the same. Our inefficiencies in manufacturing and operations, 70%, we reject 30% of what we make. Other industries look at us and smile. And, the last 3 trips to my local pharmacy, I've been sent away because the drugs have been unavailable. Now, I travel the world, and one of the key challenges I see is we are still facing shortages of not unique medicines, but actually very general medicine. So my question is, ABPI tagline is bringing medicines to life. How do we do it better? How do we do it faster? Because from what I observe, we're not doing it very well.
Lucas, I'm going to nominate you to take a view on that.
From my side, I fully agree with your comments. I'm still occasionally puzzled when I talk to some of my customers. Some of them still deal with 300 CMOs and then are astonished if the supply chains don't work. Some others try to set up a phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial. They have 2 API suppliers. They have 3 outside labs releasing. They still have 2 formulators working on it. And then they're amazed as well that something goes wrong. I think for us, it is amazing that we are actually so slowly moving to a really lean supply chain design and execution. I think everyone thinks about Amazon as the prime example. We should be able to do this. I think when I look at the CRO industry, I think in that area, actually, there was a lot of work done the last 20 years, consolidating and establishing better supply patterns that get also more specialized. In my view, I think that's something that will happen to the manufacturing development part of the pharma industry. We see at least 2-3 leaders here on the CDMO base really drive forward consolidation, really try to get aggregated services across the whole supply chain and simplify this. And I think this will, maybe it takes another 5 or 10 years, but I think at least the start is done. But it's a real challenge.
My comment would be that the days of the fully integrated pharmaceutical company are long over, I believe, but there are still judgments that need to be made by the pharmaceutical industry about how to partner in the ecosystem to really get the best of what each party can bring to bear to deliver ultimately the right medicine to the right patient. And that's far from straightforward, but that I think is the topic, and we'll spend some more time on that in the second half of the discussion. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts about big versus small or others? Okay, gentleman at the front. Thank you.
So can I ask, do you think Boston is the new pharma business model?
Sorry, can I clarify that? Was that Boston?
Yes.
Okay, who would you like to answer that question?
Well, anybody actually, because the title of this session is New Pharma Business Model. I'm not quite clear what the new pharma business model is.
Okay, well, Boston is one way of defining it. It's geographic definition. Harry, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, I think it depends whether you've got a comma in it. Is it a new business, a pharma model for a new business, or is it a new business model? I don't think there's any new business models. I think that there are models that apply for a new business that if you take into account all of the things that are happening globally and you look at innovation which is really exciting, and you look at the issue of how long it takes to get anything through, I'd come back and say, to me, it's the new businesses that are hungry, that won't wait one day. You know, each hour matters. And they're the companies that are going to drive products through faster than perhaps the larger organisation. But I think the other factor relating to that is, didn't quite answer your question, but we're looking at a complex world. It's getting more and more complex. 30 years ago, it was small molecules. Today it's not. In the process of doing that, we ought to sit back and just review all of the old products, because our understanding of disease has changed dramatically, and we forget that there are thousands of products that have been and gone. And to re-look at those old products in the light of new data provides potential for a much faster to market opportunity, and as a result, faster benefit for the patient, which is what we started with.
If I jump in there, so interesting recent experience in Cambridge, which is what I think you mean by Boston. And so I think the answer is no, because I think what Boston was 2-3 years ago was an interesting ecosystem of money, which I think is one of the benefits of scale that can be broken apart, because lots of people will give you money these days, and lots of interesting science coming out of MIT and Harvard and other places, and you had an interesting ecosystem in Kendall Square. But an interesting anecdote, we're working with mass innovation labs who are centered right on Kendall Square as a kind of incubator for new businesses. And there's a company there that's already in the space, and they've got Editas, they've got CRISPR, they've got Gritstone, and a few interesting companies. And we were running a workshop for 2 large old pharma companies, 40 people in the room to look at only one question, which was market access for a new oncology agent. And the guys from Gritstone quite reasonably said, you know, how long has it taken to get here today to this workshop? And it's taken us 5 months to just get 40 people in the room, because their calendars were all over the place, and everyone knows that struggle is true in large pharma today. And they said, well, do you know what we can do in 5 months? And I think that's the reason it's interesting. But what's happening in Kendall Square is pharma's killing it. They're gentrifying it, they're moving in, and they're putting their research divisions there as if there's some magic rubbing off from Cambridge, and it isn't. What was there has been lost because all the interesting people have moved out. So.
Please.
I mean, we all know what Harry's done is remarkable, and congratulations, etc. But sort of, you know, what we've seen in this country, we've seen many of the big farmers leave the UK. You know, even though we've got lots of talent and innovators and entrepreneurs and great universities and an NHS, etc. So my question was more, you know, where are the 10, 20, 30 billion pound companies that might become future GSKs? I mean, I had an interesting experience a few years ago in Oxford where the university appointed a new head of the business school, Peter Tofano, and he came from Harvard, and he said to this whole lecture theatre full of people, said, is there anybody in this room who can identify a FTSE 100 company that's been created in the UK in the past 20 years in our space? And, you know, we could all think of sort of Amgen and, you know, Apple and Google and Yahoo and everything else, etc. We couldn't think of one.
Well, I think Shire is a great encouragement to us as one example of a business now at 50 billion market cap approximately.
Yeah, I think if I could just, so Chaz, I think you're hitting on a point that it is an ecosystem issue, and that is that we have got an entrepreneurial SME environment, but we don't build companies for the longer term, and that's partly because of the type of investor that we tend to go to for those types of company, that they need an exit within a certain time frame, and that limits the ambition of the company, and that is an issue for us in the UK. It's not an issue in the US for different reasons. But your other point around building a cluster, which is very much focused on life science and creativity based on a strong scientific foundation. That is something that we need to try and achieve, and we probably are going in that direction with what we're doing in the southeast corner. And let's hope with the efforts up in the northwest on the previous AstraZeneca site is also going to become a world-class cluster. But that Boston model and the Bay Area model, I think, are recognised as being a very fertile way to create value, patient benefit, and secure employment for people.
I think you also need a bit of a cultural change. One of the great problems I see is that CEOs start small businesses and they keep them small because they want to keep control of them. They want them to themselves. And you have to realise that all of us have a use-by date. And some of it is short-dated stock. And the moment you realise that, and you realise that it's a sustainable business that you've got to have, it brings out a lot of other requirements. It specifies certain things. And to me, that's the fundamental part of my life is focused around that issue. Cultural. You can't do much about whether you've got the investors with the appetite, but you can, from a point of view, CEO's perception of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to build on that point about the culture. So, I'm mostly based in San Francisco now, and there is an element of that culture. If you talk to Google, so Google have currently 330 different AI programs running. And when you ask them why they have 330 different AI programs running, it's because Larry Page doesn't believe he knows the answer to AI. So he set the strategy, but he hasn't told anyone how to do it, and he's prepared to fund small experiments to find out what the answer might be, each of them with a different business model, each of them with a different value proposition, and they're all competitive. Now, which pharma company can you think of where we don't have a pyramid structure where someone at the top thinks he has to know the answer to whether this molecule hits this receptor and has no side effects? We build a pyramid structure with oracles at the top of it rather than allowing experimentation to flourish. And another interesting fact about Google, I met a guy that started one of the health divisions of Google, one of these 330, and I asked him the question, how many yeses did it take to get to start the division? It took 2. One of those was Larry Page. So, and how long did it take to get those 2? It took 2 weeks. Now, you mentioned that in most pharma companies, they think that's a crazy idea, but Google will come into healthcare, so will Samsung, so will a lot of other people, so will Apple, because that's their mentality. You've got to experiment, you've got to be prepared that you're not right every time you make a decision. You have to be prepared to manage this uncertainty, as Harry says.
Please, with the microphone, the second table. Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, Sagar Patel from Fresenius Kabi. Just back to your point there, Mike, I find that extremely exciting for a potential opportunity. We have the likes of these IT companies, as we like to call it, that are venturing into biologics and various healthcare products. In terms of a new pharma business model, I mean, we talk about scaling up through acquisition or mergers. Is collaboration not the new pharma model? And collaboration not just within the environment that we're sitting in right now, but with these people that have got the big bucks and I'd say it quite openly, the courage to invest. Your views on that?
I'll go first, but only because that ecosystem matters, right? So if you want to design in diagnostics, prognostics, if you want to design in digital, You need people that can do that, and most pharma companies don't have those competencies. And if you want to be paid for outcomes in a new business model, you have to be designing those things in, so who do you get to work with? And we're currently seen as the kind of laggards in that process, so that we're being dragged along in those big data ways, but that's the future, is in collaboration. Well, why should Samsung be better at this than we are? They don't have to be, they're just not organized in the same kind of silos as we are. So you think about collaborations of money, where that comes from. You think about collaborations with patient groups, when you look at what unmet needs really are versus what we would like them to be. You think about all kinds of collaborations that smooth the path, and they need to be all the way back in the development process, because if we try and add them later, it's only going to look like a sort of sticking plaster over the problem.
I don't think it's either or. I don't think it's collaboration or M&A. I think it's every single weapon you've got to use, and use it as effectively as you can.
I mean, the pharmaceutical industry, their efforts to collaborate with the scientific community, the academic community, has changed enormously over the last 5 years. They're making massive efforts to work with key leaders in various disease areas, and they see it more and more as a source of potential competitive advantage, actually, to connect with leading people in the academic world.
That kind of takes us more into the sort of second part of our discussion, which the language in the program is around disintermediation of the healthcare pathway. And my sense is there are opportunities in the broader ecosystem to collaborate much more and to create value in new ways than the relatively traditional product innovation value driver. So I think I'd like one or two of my panelists to sort of talk a bit about what they've seen in terms of disintermediation or new ways of engaging in the ecosystem beyond what the pharmaceutical industry has historically done. Mike?
I'll start. So, a great example, Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. One of the better, more organized patient foundations, a bit like the Michael J. Fox Group. They're actually funding their own phase 1s and phase 2s now, because they're taking molecules, as Harry says, some of them are old, and re-researching them, but against their unmet needs, with a view to essentially being a startup biotech. That's how they're behaving. And you look at how the cystic fibrosis group, got paid $4 billion for its work in cystic fibrosis from Vertex. That disintermediation means that the people who are very close to what we want and are prepared to pay for may also be prepared to fund some of the discovery and the development, and take some of the risk that they're going to try and find more products or better products in the space. So you look at, well, what is a pharma company? Is it someone that's good at discovery? Well, there's lots of people that can do that. Is it someone that's good at development? Again, I think people have made that point. Lots of people are good at that. Are they good at the regulatory piece? Well, not very, if you look at our track record. Are we good at marketing? Well, there are also people that are very good at that, and they don't all work for pharma. And you say, well, is it the aggregation of all of those things? And you go, well, no, because each of those pieces can come from somewhere else. So are we going to be disintermediated? Well, there's people with money, there's people with drugs, there's people who can develop, there's people who can market and distribute, and there's patients that will drive a lot of that, and increasingly the payers are telling us what they're prepared to pay for. So there is an inevitable, kind of inexorable disintermediation away from that monolithic pharma company, is my view.
Richard, how do you see this?
Yeah, so I think it was mentioned earlier, the discrepancy in healthcare provision and access to health in different parts of the world, and clearly the low middle income countries, for obvious reasons, don't have the healthcare systems that we have in the developed world. And as was alluded to earlier, through the efforts of Gates and other organisations, including Wellcome, there are technologies which have the potential to make a really big difference in those parts of the world. So I think from a global perspective, the biggest impact I think we are going to see in low middle income countries, and those technologies are not always going to be originated from the developed world and then deployed in the developing world. We've got experience through our initiative in India, where technologies that were created in India, originated in India, developed in India, primarily for use in India. And of course, if they're going to work in Hyderabad or rural parts of India, then they're going to work in Tokyo, New York, and London. And so one of the unintended consequences, actually, of that initiative is that device companies that we've supported in India have actually been approached by US companies to distribute the product and actually take the product through FDA approval. So I think we're also going to see a reverse technology transfer where ideas which are low, affordable ideas from the developing world actually being deployed in the developed world.
Maybe I'll add a comment myself on this question. What I see, if I was to pick one word to describe the future pharma business model that's going to be successful, is networked. I think it's really important that, as well as being clear about what one's internal strengths and capabilities are, the skills which go with being able to identify, access, and then integrate with other organizations or parties in the ecosystem to really create a joined-up solution for the end customer. Seems to me to be the only real option ultimately to create to address the challenge of the drug not being available in the pharmacy with the appropriate support. We have about 10 minutes or so to go. Great, thank you. Sorry for not seeing you. The bright light, go for it.
Mike Capaldi from Synergos. Actually, I still don't think we've addressed the biggest issue that the pharma industry is facing at the moment. And that is, how do we move from an industry that historically has provided mass drugs to mass groups of patients, which in certain diseases probably only work in about 25% of those patients, meaning we're wasting 75% of the drugs we're prescribing, to a system where we have personalized medicine. So by definition, we're giving more and more drugs, having to find more and more drugs for smaller and smaller groups of patients, which of course is giving rise to drugs that start to cost £500,000, £750,000, £1 million for a course of treatment, and a healthcare service that can't afford to do that. And actually, maybe it's the likes of the Googles and the Microsofts and other people that come in and bring a completely new perspective to pricing and patient access to patient groups. How's the industry going to address these issues? Because at the moment, we're not producing the drugs we need to produce, and we don't have a healthcare system that, if we did produce them, could afford to buy them anyway.
There's clearly a lot in that question. Does anyone want to
maybe I start first from a supply chain perspective, from a manufacturing perspective. It's interesting to see, we talked before about, not having drugs in even pharmacies in the UK. What we see is, when we work with our customers, flexibility in forecasts is one of the biggest challenges that we have, and especially if you go down the orphan drug rare disease or personalized medicines, this will even get a worse situation, because you're running multiple supply chains and they're getting more and more complex. And what we've seen now is that the paradigm is shifting. 5-10 years ago, if you would talk with a big pharma company about sharing assets or collaborating in assets, creating flexible assets, this would have been a complete no-no. Nowadays, I sit together with a lot of our customers, and they're starting to willing to explore ideas, actually to collaborate together to get manufacturing assets up and running that can be shared, that can be more flexible. We move away from the old pharma model where you build for 100% capacity and you actually run 30% in order to absorb the flexibility. And this takes a substantial part of the cost out. I mean, that is, at least from a manufacturing area viewpoint, we move in the right direction. Still, there's a lot of more to do, manage networks instead of just managing just one supplier. But I think that is at least a step in the right direction.
Mike?
I actually think personally that we need to rediscover an ethical core to the industry. I think that the age when we can price assets wherever we want is probably over, and some people are taking a long time to get that. And the idea that we can continue to launch drugs that don't work in most of the people that they are given to is probably also over. The only reason that we're there is because we have to price in the cost of our failures to every drug that launches. So if we get better at launching, you don't have to price as many failures into that model. The other thing is, if you've got to think about the challenges of the business models next to precision medicine, we don't know what the outcomes are in all of the places that we might use them yet, but even clinical studies for precision medicine is hard. Getting a patient with a rare mutation who lives in Iowa to go to a study that's in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that's hard because they've got to fund all of that themselves. So there's lots of initiatives, even to think about the business plan that gets one of those products to market. Then what does safety and efficacy look like? But we need to be comfortable to start to say, look, we're comfortable to only get paid when our drugs work. And if you're going to do that, then you have to think very differently about the path to market. You can't do the old 50-year-old approach and start to think that that's going to work in an era where you can think about precision medicine. And it is why we're going to be challenged by the technology companies, because their mindset's different. I think Trevor made the point before. If you listen to Sean Parker from the Spotify guy, the Napster guy, and his input into the IO space, the immuno-oncology space, this guy knows a lot. We can't dismiss him that he's just a tech guy. He knows a lot more than most pharma execs I've spoken to about IO, and he's put a lot of his own money into developing his own drugs. He's thinking differently about the commercial model too, and about how you get paid for value in that space. Is it simply that you held the disease at bay for a little while, or did you cure it? And are you only prepared to get paid if you cure it? And remember, these are companies that are comfortable to never make a profit. Google might be very comfortable with some of its divisions to not make a profit for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Self-driving cars, where's the business model in that? They don't know yet. They just know there's going to be something to play with. So we're going to be playing against people that don't have to make a profit this quarter because they know that they're investing for a future when they need a range of products that are fit for purpose going forward.
So I think part of the problem is that the industry is in a bit of a transition phase. It's built on low-cost manufacturing, volume-based sales, and now it's got to move to very specialised molecules that are purposed for personalised medicine. And most of the pipeline's not like that, as we discussed earlier. But as it starts to change, then I'm sure the industry is going to get a lot better at getting the right medicine at the right place to the right patient. And it probably needs to learn from the consumer industry, your fast-moving consumer goods. I mean, Coca-Cola, 5 or 6 flavours of Coca-Cola all around the world, everywhere.
I mean, a brief comment and then another question. My comment here is that the thing that the industry in general has been bad at, in my experience, is really understanding the needs of patients, being able to engage with patients and then deliver solutions that they can show the value from in respect of the patient experience. So critically, not patient populations, but individual patients in the way that retailers increasingly can do will drive a lot of the inefficiency and waste out of the system. The second piece is information management. My experience, again, the industry is rather poor at managing information, including its internal information, let alone all the wealth of information that's available externally, particularly in respect to real-world evidence, as well as other sources of useful supply chain information, for example. Cracking those two challenges as an industry, I think, would drive a huge amount of progress in respect of the question of unsustainability. Gentleman over here.
Yeah, Andy Jones from AstraZeneca. I think this might be one of the things that you start to click the 20-year clock on. But I believe there is a fundamental change in the business model which will happen. It might be driven by specialty care, but essentially I think the change that will happen, and I'd say this is a personal view, is that we will change from being a volume-based industry to becoming a service-based industry. If you look at the way Rolls-Royce operate now, they don't sell products anymore, they sell service, they sell uptime for jets. And in the specialty care world, the industry is rapidly changing to an organisations that are paid for outcomes. And if you're paid for outcomes, you have to put service alongside that. And if you're paid for outcomes, you have to understand the needs of patients, particularly where there are very small numbers of patients. But to address the chronic care disease, you also have to understand why medicines don't work and the behaviour change that you have to drive to get those to work. But it's probably a longer transition in chronic disease. But I believe there will be a fundamental change in the business model, and we will move away from being paid for the amount of volume that we put into the ecosystem and we will end up being paid for the impact that we have on outcomes for individual patients. So I don't know if you've got your stopwatch, Trevor, but you can press start now.
Excellent. We're almost there. Does anyone else have any other questions or burning thoughts? Please. Thank you. The lady just here.
Hi, Andy. My name is Bev Nicol. I'm from Pfizer. I just wanted to challenge one of your last statements, I'm afraid, where you said that supermarkets can access their customers' requirements. I'm going to challenge that because so can farmers. We just need to change the way we think. And that's the piece that I think is going to be focused on a little more tomorrow with the patient centricity piece and how farmers are now reaching out to get the patient feedback. Now, whether that's through the investigators, whether that's through the clinical trial team, but I just wanted to challenge you slightly that that is happening now, but it is a change. It's not something that's always been done.
I agree. I think a lot of the restraints that the industry sees are actually self-imposed in respect to their ability to engage with patients, fears around compliance and regulatory questions and so on. I actually work with many companies on this question. I see a lot of progress here, but there's still a lot of good words, but actual on-the-ground change is still significant. You know, there's a significant way to go, in my view. Maybe not 20 years, but we'll see. Yes, so I think possibly a final question at the back, or comment.
Thanks. Name's Bill Dawson. Really, it's a generic question to the panel. What we're hearing you do is to try to provide a single answer to a problem that's rather more complex than that. Patients differ, medicines differ, and we've tried to describe a business model where if you're into precision medicine, then either it's a novel precision medicine and it may well come with a diagnostic, or it's a use of an existing medicine into a genetically typed patient population, and the solution to the two issues for those two sets of molecules are quite different. To actually imagine that you can get one solution to it, I think is difficult, and none of you really have addressed the risk issue to make sure that any of these molecules are safe when you wish to put them into the marketplace. And those costs aren't going to change very much because the burden to make them safe in terms of patient population doesn't change very much. Would anybody like to comment on that?
I'll make one brief comment on behalf of the panel and then suggest we take that into the break. My brief comment is I don't think any of us see one model. Ultimately, it's going to be many different ways of playing in the ecosystem to create value for patients. Otherwise, let's continue the discussion. I'd love to have the chance to do that. Respectful of the time, I believe we're almost there at break time. I think we have about half an hour for networking. I'm not sure if any of the organisers want to make any other comments, but assuming not, then I suggest we break here. I'd like to thank my co-panellists and also everyone in the audience for your questions.